our next presenter is a writer and a director, and he's actually working on a movie right now, and it's going to be called The Believers. And it's actually a movie that kind of touches on mental illness. So here we have Mr. David Quillin.
Thank you. How y'all doing? So far we've talked about beads and chocolate, two things that everyone loves, so now I get to ruin it by talking about something really depressing. Art sanity, which is a funny word. It's not a proper word when you get right down to it, but it conveys an image, an archetype, a stereotype. The mad artist, the tortured genius, someone who pays for their creative abilities with a life of pain and misery. I believe this. I think this is a true concept. I don't think it's a myth. I think that there is a link between creativity and mental illness, and so do a lot of psychologists, sociologists, psychiatrists, and neurologists. Genius and lunacy are linked somehow, and they always have been. Now, art makes us curious. I refuse to believe that I'm the only person who looks at these pieces and says, "What the hell is this? What is it supposed to be?" It's expertly done, it's obviously very deliberate, but what does it mean? What are we supposed to get from it? And you're not just curious about art. Sometimes you're curious about the artists themselves, the people who create. Why do they make the things that they make? How much of themselves is reflected in their work? Now, artists are unique, but they're not that hard to find. Go out and ask one, talk to one. Here's the problem with that. A lot of the most brilliant and gifted people in the world tend to be the most eccentric. Not easy to talk to. How do you communicate with somebody you can't talk to? And how do you learn something about someone you can't communicate with? Vincent van Gogh, one of the most famous painters in the history of the world, of course, died broke and completely unknown. Suffered from terrible bouts of depression and anxiety, inexplicable remorse. He did not understand why he suffered from these conditions, but he certainly did. They essentially visited him without warrant or cause. Now look at some of his work. We've got the irises, the sunflowers, the chair. Van Gogh focused a lot of his energy on mundane objects, which he rendered unique through his perception. He saw the world in a way that nobody else really does. Some of his other work, Starry Night, the church, the flowers, you'll notice that he focused on things that were static, that were inanimate. They had a sense of tranquility, a sense of peace, a sense of calm. He didn't have that. He wanted it, but he didn't have it. That's why he painted it. That's where he got it in his life. Michelangelo, who was considered by a lot of his fellow Florentines to be a real pain to work with. Nobody liked him. He was moody, he was pushy, he was a know-it-all. And in fairness, there were a lot of things that he did know. So he was contracted by Pope Julius II to paint the roof of the Sistine Chapel. I've seen this thing. It's 134 feet long, 44 feet wide, then the Last Judgment, which is 45 feet tall and 40 feet wide. How in the hell could he possibly have done this by himself? How do you conquer this? It's massive. And if you look at the detail work, you'll see that he did not paint in broad strokes. Everything that he put in with meticulous effort, because he had obsessive compulsive disorder. Seriously, that's what allowed him to do this without making himself nuts. He did this 10 to 12 hours every day for 4 years, and that's the only way he could stand it. Edvard Munch, who's another painter, we know from a lot of the letters that he has written that, like Van Gogh, he suffered from depression, anxiety. He also had this pervasive fear, dread, impending sense of doom. Never could understand it, never understood why he suffered from it, but he did. Now, unlike Van Gogh, Munch did not paint the things that he lacked and that he coveted. He painted what he felt. This is him. This is the way he saw himself in the world, which is pretty damn scary when you think about it. You stare at this thing long enough and you will get a sense of the fear that he felt. Edgar Allan Poe, a lot of people know that he led a very sad and troubled life. He had a problem with depression. He had a problem with substance abuse. He had a knack for falling in love with women who either didn't love him back or who died. Once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered weak and weary, it's sad. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books some cease of sorrow. His sorrow is evident everywhere in that poem, and in an awful lot of other things that he wrote. Lewis Carroll, mathematician, author, wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. He suffered from a rare neurological disorder. It's linked to migraines, and it causes hallucinations. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this is odd because it was the middle of the night. Trippy. 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd because, they hadn't any feet. This man lived in a perpetual state of psychosis in the literal sense. He'd broken from reality. He couldn't help it. It was a biological fact. Every one of these artists is gone. And even if they weren't, you might have a hard time learning much about them by talking to them. They were all brilliant, but they were all mentally ill. And there is, and always will be, a communication barrier between people who are mentally ill and people who are not. But artists who are mentally ill create a bridge between themselves and the rest of society. Their art is not there purely for visceral appeal. You can understand something of who they are through it. Even if you can't communicate with them directly, you can understand some of the things that they leave behind. And I guess that's it.